Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Christine Mallins, and I'm the director of the Center for Social Science Scholarship, which is hosting today's event. So that you all know, some of the particulars of this workshop are going to be geared towards the social sciences, but most of the information that you are going to hear will be applicable across disciplines. We are going to record and to also post the recording on our YouTube channel. So we will put that information in the chat. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel to get more content like our session today. You can also follow our My UMBC group, and you can follow us on social media as well. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our two speakers for today. First is Angie Schaffer. She is a Baltimore-based grants and development consultant who has proposed and managed grants funded by federal U.S. agencies, including the Department of State and the Department of Education, foreign governments, the Maryland State Department of Education, and many local and national corporate funders and foundations. Our second speaker is Deb Geer, who is the Associate Director of MyPAR, which is the Grants Administration Unit within the Center for Social Science Scholarship. Deb will be talking today about what you need to know about the administrative process side of preparing and submitting proposals, and then administering awards once they're received. So without further ado, I will go ahead and turn things over to Angie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me, and a special shout out to Kara Seidel, who introduced me to Dr. Melanson, and we were able to talk about this opportunity. So like Dr. Melanson said, I'm Angie Schaffer. I am the founder of A to Z Ventures. I provide consulting services to different organizations in Baltimore. As of this week, I'm also the executive director of the Fund for Education Abroad. We're a nonprofit that raises scholarship funding for underrepresented students so they can study abroad. So this is a very down and dirty workshop. There's a reason it's a garage and not a formal workshop. That's because the information I'm going to give to you today is actually based in a 2-day workshop that I've provided to different organizations and to faculty at universities and colleges. So this is sort of an intro to grant writing and funding and seeking funding. And then obviously I'll include some resources for you to learn a bit more about it through other means and mechanisms. But yeah, this is just kind of meant to be a very down and dirty, like briefing overview, whatever you want to call it, with grants and fundraising. So our objectives today, we're going to build a knowledge of grant types and typical proposal components, understand funder interests and relationship development, review the UMBC proposal process, which Deb is going to help me a lot with talking through. And then we'll also talk about timelines for successful development and submissions of proposal. And what I really want you to leave here with is a sense of how you would like to approach funding opportunities. I also think that quite a few of the skills and things that we're going to talk about are applicable, not just to like funding and grants specifically, but also would be helpful for you potentially if you're pursuing PhD candidacy and writing applications. Once you start actually writing research applications and things like that, if you haven't done that already, I'm hopeful that a lot of these skills will sort of translate over and you can think about your particular and individual approach to seeking funding. So we'll talk a little bit about the phases of pursuing funding. But phase 1 is seeking and considering funding. Phase 2 is the proposal process. So we'll talk a little bit about the components and figuring out how to navigate doing research about funders and what they want and how you can manifest what you want in writing what it is they want to see. And then thinking a little bit about your own process and how to individualize it for yourself in a way that works best for you and maximizes your strengths, but also allows you to seek out assistance for the things that you don't feel as strong in. And then finally, phase 3, talking about whether or not you get the funding, whether or not you get the funding with caveats or just straight up, and whether you're denied the funding and might be able to come back with a stronger application the next time. So the first thing I wanted to do, and Amy, this is where I'll need your help with some small groups, for about 3 to 5 minutes. A point of this workshop, and I feel like any workshop I do, is not just for people to get the content a better understanding of the content I'm presenting, but I also want you all to get to know each other, particularly after the last year and a half or so of everybody being in Zooms and things like that. So in your small groups, I'd like you to introduce yourselves, maybe just give 1 or 2 sentences about your experience with grants and your experience with seeking funding. And then if you got $35,000 today as grant funding, what would it be for? Would you use it to pursue travel for research? Would you use it to start a program at UMBC? Would you use it to do something else that isn't buying a car or something, but something in the way of social sciences and your own research interests? So Amy, if you could do that, we'll give everybody about 3 to 5 minutes to chat about that in their small groups, and then we'll call everyone back. Well, thanks everyone. Hopefully you got to maybe meet someone you didn't know before. So as we go through the workshop, I just want to remind everyone, if you have a question, you're welcome to drop it, whether it's directly to me or to everyone in the chat box. So please feel free to put questions there. And every time we have sort of a transition interval, I'll take a look and see what questions have come up from you. So the first thing we're going to talk about is why you would get money from a funder. So there's a couple different reasons or sort of ways to get money. One, philanthropy. Your cause aligns with the funder's cause. Your interests align with their interests, or they're interested in something that you want to do. Government, you're advancing policy or other goals of the current administration or the department through which you're applying for funding. As a subcontractor, you're going to be a funding recipient that's been trusted to allocate money for services rendered that reach an overall goal or objective for a cause. And then as a sub-award, basically you are applying for funding via another primary award winner, and you're contributing meaningfully to their overall goals and projects. But you don't have to manage the overall award. Because of the different types of agreements, it's really important to understand what you're sort of obligating yourself to if you do want to pursue funding or if you're accepting funding. So it's important to note the differences between those types and what they sort of end up meaning and committing you to. So as a contractual agreement, you're providing direct benefits or services. Often contracts are with government funders, but not exclusively. As a cooperative agreement, this could be something where you're working together with another entity to receive a grant, but there's substantial involvement expected. I've seen this go lots of different ways. Sometimes direct grants have felt more like cooperative agreements. Sometimes cooperative agreements have implied that there would be a lot of involvement and feedback from the funder, but then they sort of end up being very hands-off. So those are things that you can think about if you end up getting into a place where you're looking at the type of an agreement and you have questions about how that agreement will impact the relationship with the funder. And then grants and sponsored research, typically used to advance a public purpose or your research in the field, supporting and stimulating activity in your field or your sector. It can sometimes be a partnership or a cooperative agreement. But typically it's much more sort of what you want to do and what you're interested in, and then you just sort of report out on what the outcomes and outputs are. And grants and sponsored research can fall sort of under multiple categories, including sub-awards or sponsored project awards. And I put this at the very front of the workshop, even though it might seem a little weird to look at this already, only because this is something that if you're considering funding should be at the forefront of the way you're thinking about the funding. So you should know before you even start to go down the pathway of like applying for funding, which of these types of agreements the funding would fall under and what you are therefore obligated for. So rationales for funding requests. There are things that funders want to see, and there are things that they probably know in the back of their mind, but they don't want you to say outright. So you really shouldn't say it outright in your letter of intent, your proposal narrative, or really imply it in any way. So the reasons, the good sort of acceptable, justifiable reasons for applying for funding, they can be vast, but here are just a few. Developing best practices as an institution or as a department in an institution, improving access, addressing specific challenges in your field or your sector, or things that sort of haven't been uncovered yet, I'm expecting that a lot of like post-COVID funding awards are going to be, addressing things like DEI, public health, things that obviously have been at the forefront for some institutions or some funders, but are really sort of coming to the surface now. Increasing partnerships, advancing understandings and advancing your field, advancing relationships and partnerships in your field, developing researchers in the field and future potential leaders. And then obviously cultivating research and diverse learning among students, and particularly you as grad students, how that can sort of have a trickle down effect potentially for undergraduate students at UMBC. Less than ideal reasons. And again, this doesn't mean that these aren't reasons to apply for funding, but they're things that you probably shouldn't outright say in your proposal. Making up for budget cuts, creating a position for yourself, or like justifying and substantiating something for yourself or your department. Responding to directives that are very specific, whether it's to your university, your organization, the university system. So i.e., the president has said, for example, we want more students to be in social research internships. You're not going to necessarily say, well, my president said that this is what we have to do, so this is why we're applying for this funding. You want it to obviously be based more sort of in best practices and the philosophy of like why that would improve your institution overall. Paying for items that weren't in the operating budget, you're not going to ask a funder for money for laptops, and that's the primary reason you're applying for something. You want to obviously ground it in something a bit more substantial and long lasting. And then lastly, to pursue travel or research sabbaticals. Again, there are often funds that are specified for those kinds of things. And so in something like that that's super specific, it would be okay to mention these kinds of things. But overall, you really want the funder to read your proposal and leave it with an understanding of how you're going to make your field, your institution, your organization, the world a better place. So that was a super basic sort of introduction to why funding exists and how to sort of start your journey looking for it and the kinds of things to keep in mind as you're looking at different funding opportunities. So some of my tips for starting out, when I start to dig into something that's a funding opportunity, I will often like just get a piece of paper and sort of visualize what it is, right? Like, what does it mean? What's my timeline going to look like? What's my idea? Write out like a bullet list of things that you want to put in the proposal. Just somehow sort of like starting to track all your ideas and all the things that you're going to do. Some of my colleagues in the past have done, charts, like they create a Excel sheet that's like, the funder, what they're looking to fund, what you want to be funded, like deadline, those kinds of things. So any way that you can start to keep the proposal process organized is, I think, a place for you to start, and really for you to think about like holistically what it means to apply for this type of funding. So moving into the proposal process, which is sometimes a little overwhelming, depending on what it is that the funder is asking for. It can be something where you feel like you have strengths in some areas and you're not as strong in other areas. So I think it's important to, as you get into the actual process and thinking about all the different components, this is a place for you to start honestly reflecting on, what it is you feel like you're capable of doing and have strengths in, and where you might be able to improve some of your skill sets. This is also a place for you to think about, is this proposal process, if it's like $1,000, but it's requiring like a 12-page narrative and a crazy budget, and for your institution to sign off on it, thinking through like, is this worth it? Because in the end, if you think about the value of your time, the value of others' time, and the likelihood that you're going to get something, there are some times where even though grants and funding opportunities are money and funding, it may not be worth it in the end. So this is also where thinking through the proposal process will come in handy. And Kara, that's a really good question. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So these are your typical components of a proposal. This does not by any means mean that every proposal will require all of these things. But these are just some general components that it might be helpful for you to have sort of an understanding of before you dig into any request for a proposal or a notice of a funding opportunity. And there's the 3 Ps that sort of guide my work through the proposal process are the project and, figuring out what it means to develop a thorough proposal, planning, and then permissions. So thinking through who's going to need to be involved in the proposal process outside of, yourself or your group that's working on it. The letter of intent, the letter of inquiry, these are pretty standard. Sometimes they will serve as like a cover sheet, and they're weirdly not due before a proposal is due, but most of the time you submit the letter of intent to apply for funding or the letter of inquiry to kind of indicate that you're interested in the funding prior to the proposal. Some organizations use this also as a way to sort of weed out what it is that they're thinking of funding and what it is that they're going to come back and say, maybe try for next time, and give you a little feedback about how to get it in a better place for an application in the future. The executive summary and abstract, those are things that they basically summarize your project. And those are components that you will likely come back to a gazillion times as you think through your project. It's helpful to develop one early in the process in the event that you need to email or connect with collaborators that are either going to support your work or provide letters of support or will be partners in the work that you're proposing. But again, it's something that will probably evolve over the course of you writing your actual proposal. A narrative proposal, generally, these are very different in what funders want to see. Sometimes it's like a quick 1 or 2 pager. Sometimes it's like a 40 pager. But generally, a narrative proposal talks about why your work is needed. So you justifying the work that you're proposing to do. And then it talks about the goals and objectives of your work. It'll also often address things like your qualifications to do this work, your partnerships, where you're going to be doing this work, tapping a little bit into the budget and kind of explaining generally the funding that's needed. So there's a lot of different components that will often go into a narrative, but they're very specific for the funder. So every funder is very different. The budget is obviously going to be important. You want to make sure that if you're looking at a proposal, a call for proposals, and you have an idea that what you have will basically be able to be covered by the budget that is being talked about by the funder. Some funders don't actually give budget parameters. So it's often in those cases, it's really important to connect with the funder and find out some sense of what they're willing to give. For others, they'll give you budget parameters and there's sort of a low end or a high end. Sometimes it's just the high end. So it's important just to make sure that, you're not proposing something where it's this massive project and you're going to get like 5,000 of it covered by one grant and you have no idea how you're going to cover the rest of your expenses. So just thinking through what that would look like. And again, your budget is something that also will change a ton over the course of you actually creating your proposal. The budget narrative just walks through the different aspects of the budget in a narrative format. So, you have a budget that has, for example, the research travel. You have a budget that it talks about research supplies. You have a budget that might talk about databases or other like platforms that you're going to need to purchase or subscribe to. So in the budget narrative, you identify those and you just literally walk through the budget and talk about why those are important to your project. Many proposals will ask you for previously awarded grants or awards. If they're relevant to that work, it's going to be important to include those. Sometimes people put that into the narrative proposal. Other times it's a whole other aspect of the proposal. And it is something that if you're not sure and you're also applying on behalf of a department at UMBC, for example, that you might be able to talk with your department about other sort of relevant funded projects that happened previous, even if you weren't directly involved in them, just to give them the sense that the department is sort of fluent in providing all the reporting and everything to successfully implement a funded project. Resumes and CVs are often requested for any, not just the PI, the primary investigator or principal investigator, but also for the for anybody who would be involved in the project. Sustainability plan, those are tricky sometimes because basically an organization might be saying, here, we're going to give you $50,000 to get this off the ground, but how are you going to sustain this work once you don't have our $50,000? So those are always a little funny and tricky to write, and we can talk about that a little bit later, but it's important to know that many places, many funders will be looking for sort of what the long-term effects of the funding, of their initial funding period are going to be, and they consider that your sustainability plan. Timelines and work plans, sometimes they're different and a funder will request both, but sometimes it's the same kind of a thing. And it just talks through like what work is going to be done, who is going to do it, when it's going to be done by. And with a work plan, the additional aspect that a timeline might not have is what the outputs or outcomes of that work will be, sort of what objectives and goals that work is going to target and who's going to be monitoring that. Data management plan. So if you are doing research and there's going to be data that has private information that you need to secure, you're going to need to talk about how you're going to manage that data and how you're going to make it secure. Monitoring and evaluation plan. This is my absolute least favorite thing to do for any opportunity I have ever pursued. Some people are great at it. Others, it's just not in their strength wheelhouse, and I can do them. I just do not enjoy doing them. It's talking about how you're going to monitor and how you're going to evaluate your project, and very specifically looking at what objectives things are going to cover, who's going to be monitoring it, how it's going to be monitored, surveys and things like that. So this is where a lot of the sort of future planning for your award takes place in this component. Letters of reference and letters of support, these are just important to get from anybody who's going to be involved in the project or anybody who can talk about the strengths of your work that they've seen prior that would contribute to the success of this project. Approvals, so this is just a smattering. This is not specifically for UMBC. Deb is going to talk a little bit more about the approval process and just the proposal process in general at UMBC. But your IRB office, your provost, grants compliance office, your VP for finance, your legal team, any and all of these might be involved in an approval process for a funded opportunity. And so it's going to be important for you to understand institutionally specifically where these approvals need to come from, or if you end up pursuing funding for an organization you're working with or whatever, where their approval processes lie. Lastly, the standard forms, the application forms, government standard forms are always kind of crazy and involve a lot of information if you're applying for government funding. Other organizations and foundations have their own forms. Sometimes it's very specific, just very general, specifically like organizational information or information about you as the PI. Other times it's really general and just, what you're interested in doing, your name and your contact information, and that's it. So those are the components. That's a lot of information to go through. Thanks for sticking with me. If you have questions about these, there are definitely some resources that I've included at the end of the presentation to kind of talk through where you could find more information about these. And any idea why I have starred a few of these? Does anybody want to throw it out in the chat? Yes, no, maybe. So I have starred a couple of these because these are things that are typical in a component, in a proposal as components, but they're also the things that generally will kind of take the most time and that you'll probably come back to a lot during the course of writing a proposal. So thinking about your role as a proposal writer or even a collaborator, if this is going to be a sort of a team effort, when you're working your way through the proposal, reaching out to the program officer or the funder in any way possible is really important. Getting necessary approvals from your institution is really important. Working through the narrative, writing it, rewriting it, maybe seeking out some feedback from somebody is important. Working through the budget, and again, making sure that it just keeps aligning with what you're going to do, despite any changes your idea goes through as a result of going through the proposal writing process. This is important. And then lastly, with submission, it might be you that submits it, but it might also be someone else at UMBC that needs to submit it, depending on the type of award. So it's important to know that going in terms of like who needs to submit it and what's the process for getting it to them so that they can submit by the deadline. In terms of pre-award, so you've submitted your proposal, you're waiting to hear back. What's your role? What are you going to be doing? This is a great time to sort of contact or reconnect with others that might be impacted by the award. If you're definitely getting the sense that you're going to be highly competitive, or even if you're not, it's a good way to kind of reach out to other offices, because if you get feedback but you don't get the award, it might be something that you can take to another funder. Negotiating the conditions of the award. So sometimes if you're actually a finalist for an award, the organization, the funder, the government entity will reach out to you to start to talk about what it means to get this award and what you'd be obligated to. So this is where you can start to talk about what that would look like, and maybe even negotiating some of the conditions of the award. Seeking out the subcontractors and the subawardees if necessary. So if you know you put money in for subawardees or subcontractors, while you're waiting to hear back, this is a good time to either retain those connections or start to connect with places that you might put an RFP out to if you were to receive the award. And thinking also about necessary hires, particularly at an institution, might be a means, it might be necessary to be connected to HR and other departmental sort of administrative entities to make sure you have the necessary mechanisms in place to get the hires made quickly if you get the award, because a lot of times there's a quick turnaround in terms of expectations from the funder. And post-award, obviously, these are just important things to keep in mind if you do receive an award, making sure that you are compliant with everything. These are the budget building basics, and you can find these templates online in lots of different places, but most of the time, funders will give you a template or at least give you some guidance on what they expect to see. Some important things to just remember between direct costs and indirect costs. Direct costs are allowable, reasonable, allocable, and treated consistently. So this is, direct costs are, things like salaries, things like travel, things like specific equipment you've put in. Indirect costs are the NICRA, which is the Negotiated Indirect Cost Rate Agreement. And I think Deb might end up talking a little bit about that. But they're essentially the cost of doing business necessary for general operations of the organization. So for example, when you put in a negotiated indirect cost rate, you're thinking about, what's the cost to keep the lights on in the office you're going to be doing this research in. And then a very important question about the budget: is cost share required? So are you obligated as the recipient of this funding to provide any kind of cost share? Do you have to throw in like a staff person who's going to provide not free, but you're not asking for salary for the work that they're going to be covered? Is there the possibility of getting like office space, and you can say that you're getting a certain amount in terms of what that rent would be that's covered that you're not asking for in the grant? So thinking through, if it's required, how you're going to actually substantiate it. So these are just some frequently asked questions in terms of how much time, will I have to submit a proposal? It depends when you see the proposal, the call for proposals, and when you need to turn it around, but also keeping in mind the permissions and any other parts of the institutional process that you have to make sure you abide by. Outcomes versus outputs. This is something we can talk about in a little bit, but basically an outcome of something is a very general goal. So i.e. you are promoting research among undergraduate students at UMBC and providing research skills to them. Outputs would be something like you have a specific workshop, you're going to get like 20 students to attend, and they will be engaged in this workshop and leave with an understanding of how to do more research. Thinking through operating costs versus project or program costs. So how much does it cost to, again, generally like keep the lights on, or provide, salaries for people versus what is something specific for the project or the program? So do you have to buy any equipment for that program specifically to run? Asking for the maximum or the minimum, it really depends on the funder, but it's good to talk with a program officer and gauge that. And then thinking through if you're looking at individual opportunities for funding versus institutional fundings, obviously there's just going to be a difference in terms of your proposal process and the components maybe that are going to be addressed. And now I'm going to hand it over to Deb, who's going to talk with you about the proposal process from the UMBC side specifically.
Thank you, Angela. Wow, good information. I'm telling you, you did that very fast too. It is down and dirty, isn't it? So my name's Deb Gear, and as Christine introduced me at the beginning, I'm the Associate Director of Maryland Institute for Policy Analysis and Research, and we are housed within the UMBC Center for Social Science Scholarship. What we do is we assist faculty and graduate students with obtaining funding and research. We provide pre and post award assistance with the process. So if you're a graduate student in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, other than psychology, we will help you with your proposal. Next slide, please. Actually, I think I should have already said that. Next slide. Yeah, next slide, okay. So where do you get started with the UMBC process? So the first thing you want to do if you found some research that is in your wheelhouse and you want to apply for it is reach out to your department chair and to your faculty mentor. They're very important that they know what's going on and what you're doing. Why? Because they will work in conjunction with you. They'll help you every step of the way. You get a good faculty mentor and you have nothing to worry about. So make sure you have a faculty mentor. The other reason that's important is because they have to initiate the contact with the Office of Sponsored Programs. They have to be the PI on your proposal. So it's important to have them. They also will initiate contact with the business unit that will be assisting you with your proposal and the quality routing. So when you route through quality, it's a tedious process, but we're here to help you along the way, and we will assist you any way we can. We'll tell you all the components you need and guide you. And if your research involves your thesis or your dissertation, that's another reason why you should work very, very closely with your faculty mentor. They've done this before. They've made all the mistakes. They know what to do, what not to do, and they are a wealth of information. Okay, next one, please. Okay, so after you have everything arranged with your faculty mentor and your chair, what next? That's where we come in. Reach out to MyPAR. And if you're in psychology, because we may have some psychology students out there, reach out to Amy Schneider. She does what we do, and she's great. What we'll do is we'll read the RFP, make sure that we'll meet with you to make sure that you know all the components that you need to do the research. We will go over it step by step, piece by piece, once, twice, ever how many times you need us to. And we'll, make sure that you understand all the requirements. And Angela was talking about the budget and the budget justification. This is probably the part where you need assistance the most, because we know what to do and not to do, what's allowable and what's not allowable, because we've been doing this for so long and that's what we're trained to do. And you're not, So I think that's where faculty say we're the most valuable to them. We'll help you build your budget justification. A lot of times, you're not really sure if you need something or not, and we can talk it through with you to get you through that portion of the process. And the budget justification, you need to make sure that you fully justify everything you need in your proposal, and we'll help you do that. You know, as Angela mentioned, a lot of times the budget they have caps on them. They have a lot of weird requirements or things that you can't do. So we'll help you understand that and help you work around it. Angela mentioned that you should work with HR and with the payroll and making sure that there's mechanisms in place to pay whoever is required for your research. My part will actually do that for you because we understand the language, we understand what they're saying, and we can interpret that for you. We also will check the formatting. You know, all of the RFPs and the sponsors, they have different formats they want, believe it or not, different fonts and things like that, and we will check that for you and keep you in line with that. Excuse me. We will also keep you have to watch your time. You have to watch when it's due, how much time I have to do it, because it will get away from you. There's also an internal time management for the routing process. So it's not just, oh, this is due to the sponsor on June the 1st, so I have until May the 31st to get this done. No, you have to, you know, back into the routing process, and that usually takes about, from the time that you have the concept until the time that proposal's done, depending on the complexity of it, it could take 6 weeks. So 6 to 8 weeks, we say, you need to start, you know, getting things in line. And I actually have a timeline. We have a timeline. The college has a timeline that will be provided for you. So my theory is I actually had a 5 Ps and Angela had a 3 Ps. And when I read her thing, I realized that I was going to include my 5 Ps then. So my 5 Ps is prior planning prevents poor proposals. Just keep that in mind, and also keep in mind that you're not alone. We're here for you, and we will help you through this process. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. There's a training that is required if you're going to do a proposal and apply for research. It's called the CITI training. It's Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative. It is a third party. If you click on this link, it takes you to a third party, and you'll find the training there. LSP told me that you must take this, and that's really the only thing that you are required to take, but there's a lot of other research modules on this site, and they encourage you to take the other ones, but it's not required. And there's another link here that it goes to the compliance, which is part of the Office of Research, and that somebody will help you if you send an email to that if you get stuck on that training. I'm not familiar with it, but they will be able to help you. Slide, please. Okay, so what if you need data? So if you need data, you're going to have to get a data use agreement. Depending on if you're applying for it or if the university is applying for it. Sometimes it depends. The sponsor may give it to you. They may say no. We can only issue it to a university. If it's the university that's going to get the data, then the data use agreement must be signed by our AOR, which is our authorized official representative. And this is a person from our Office of Sponsored Programs. No one other than them can be considered an authorized representative, so they have to sign it. And they will be responsible for reviewing and negotiating if there's any negotiating to be done. Good news is you don't have to do it. They will do it for you. They know what we can and we can't do, so we leave it up to them. And again, if you need something like this, my part will help you along the way with this process also. So in either scenario, you need to alert your faculty mentor that you're going to, be getting a data use agreement, and they will also help you through the process. For an IRB, human subject, IACUC, that's animal, if your research involves animals, you have to go through the Office of Research Protection and Controls. The gentleman's name over there is Tim Sparkling, and I'll provide his email address for you, and he can help you with those requirements. They just in Koala, they just added this module into the Koala process, so you can go in there into the module and do some of the work in there as well. And we'll help you through all that. There are so many people in this wonderful university to support you through your research process. So that's good to have that support. There are universities out there that don't. I've worked with them, and so you guys are very fortunate. UMBC has a really strong infrastructure for research support. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, this is just a few of your again, resources. There's a wealth of information out there on these websites. Go on them and explore and look around for what you need or information. And if you don't find what you need, then let us know, and we'll help you. We'll help to find it. And they talked about the post award, and I didn't realize I was going to speak on that. But real quickly, if you do get an award, there is also support, for that. Also, if you get the award, my part will help you with, hiring people, supplies, anything that you need. We watch the finances for you. We have, we will help you with everything but the science part. So there's support out there, and I'm sure there's, Christine has, advised people on the science part of it and help them through that process. And there are other people out there to do that, and your faculty mentor. So I hope that helps, and that you guys got something from that information.
Thanks so much, Deb. Yeah, what you mentioned about, making sure you're meeting the requirements post-award. Things often, particularly with research funding, you're waiting for like a while to hear back, and then all of a sudden you hear back and it's like you have like a month to get going, right? Like it's just quick implementation. And so it's really helpful to know that MyPAR will be there to help as, any recipients of funding try to start navigating what that looks like, particularly.
Oh, I lost you.
Was
There
that
you go.
the whole time?
No, just for a second.
No,
Yeah.
just for a second, yeah.
Yeah, I think it can be just very overwhelming to manage a grant, and to know that your office is there to assist with that and help make sure that sort of the research and the work of the grant can still be sort of the primary focus of the PI or any of the applicants is really important.
That's why it can get away from you really fast, like you said, and it's good to know that there is support and you're not alone, and it can be intimidating.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Very much so. Thank you, Deb.
All right, thank you.
And if anybody has any questions for Deb and for MyPAR, please also feel free to put them in the chat. So this is the conclusion for part 2. We're almost in the final part of the workshop. But thinking through what are the proposal components that might take you the most time. So I feel like that's very helpful as you are starting to dig in and you create your visual representation or your written representation or your chart, Excel sheet, wherever you're going to be starting to track this information, figuring out what you're going to need to dedicate the most time to. And again, where you're strong and where you might pull in others that are strong for feedback. Thinking about where you're going to need to reach out to others, where you need to reach out to MyPAR to get information that you need to include, reaching out to places that might be providing letters of support for you or faculty members, making sure you're giving them lots of time to get back to you with that, with those materials, because I've often found that sometimes, you know, you just need to remind people, and you don't want to give people like a few days to get something significant, particularly if that's going to be a big part of the rubric that's used for scoring your grant application. If letters of support are 20 points of 100 points, you don't want to wait until the last week to try to start collecting them. And thinking through, you know, where you're going to be able to get other information like data to substantiate what you're going to be doing. Kara asked a good question. How do you focus grant apps that are from interdisciplinary backgrounds or pull from multiple fields? And my answer to that would be, go back to the RFP, go back to the call for the proposals, or see how sort of wide you can take your proposal in terms of the narrative and what you need to describe, but really focus it in on what the funder is wanting to see. So whether that's taking like the different strengths of those who are coming from the different backgrounds and how they're gonna focus in on one thing that you're looking to pursue with the funding. Also making sure that people from different fields are going to be your second, third, fourth, and fifth eyes for your proposal. Making sure you're getting feedback from people in the different fields, I think it could be a way to sort of make your proposal even more solid. But I would say focus on what the funder wants, focus on what you want to do, see where there's the overlap in terms of bringing in the perspectives from the different fields, and bringing in what you want to do, and then thinking through like what the outcome is going to be and the impact on the fields. And it might end up being very specific. It might be able to be a little bit broader, but again, what you're applying for is what the funder wants, and just keep going back to that as much as you can throughout your proposal process. So lastly, with submission and decision. So we'll talk a little bit about the steps to submission, which we also have talked about with Deb, and I got to a little bit in the last section. The things that you basically want to make sure you're doing, proofing best practices, and then looking at what the rubric would look like for you to be scored on any submission and why that's important. So the things that you like absolutely, I think, need to do. I'm not sure why that ended up here, but I'll explain in a little bit. But absolutely be a snoop. Go to the funder's website and see what their recent events were. See if they have a blog. See if they have an example of a prior successful application. Look at what their priorities are. Do they have a revised mission statement? Are you able to incorporate what their mission is into your proposal? Even if it's verbatim taken from their website, you could say, you know, this is something where we have significant overlap in what I want to do and what I'm asking for the funding for and what you all want to do, short end or long term. If they have webinars, make sure you attend them. Make sure the funder sees your name in there. Make sure anybody who's co-writing something with you or is going to play a significant role in the work that you're proposing is also on those webinars. Making sure you're reaching out to the program officers for funding. And, you know, I think a really good way to start doing this is to read through the call for proposals, so the RFP or the NOFO, the Notice of the Funding Opportunity, checking off where you might have any questions that you can put in an email. And then calling is still like a very acceptable sort of strange thing to do, but it's acceptable. If there's a phone number and contact information for a program officer, it's because the funder expects you to reach out to that program officer. So do that so that they know your name, and you might even be able to, with a phone call, sort of get some information that otherwise would be tricky to pull out in an email in writing. Reading about previously funded projects, so that you're making sure you're sort of in the right stream of where the funder wants to go in terms of the programming they're funding, but also making sure that you're not like legit just replicating something else that's already been done. asking for examples of successful proposals. So even if something like that is not readily available on a website or in the the RFP or in the NOFO, you can still ask for it. They may not give it to you. They may give it to you, but with like lots of things sort of blacked out and chunked out or missing pages. But regardless, it can be very helpful to read through what someone else successfully wrote and got funding for. And just again, coming back to like the alignment between funder goals and mission, and then your strategic plan and your goals and your mission, whether it's as an individual, as a department, or as an institution. So the steps to submission, reading the RFP or the notice of the funding opportunity extremely carefully, highlighting like certain things that you know you'll need to be reminded of. I recently read through an RFP, a request for proposals, that was like 65 pages. And I just knew I wasn't going to remember what was said on page 12 about a particular budget thing. So I made notes, but I also, I'm a big fan of like, this is very old school, I feel like, but printing it out and actually going through with Post-its and putting things on, putting things where I know I'll need to come back to later. Again, making sure that it's feasible, like this 65-page proposal, request for proposals rather, that we got, the organization that was asking me to write it, they only gave me a few days notice. And the proposal, even through all those pages, I still couldn't get a sense of like how long the proposal was supposed to be and all of the different elements that it required. It was very generalized. It was talking more about their mission as a funder than like what they were trying to get from this funded opportunity. So making sure that it's feasible, making sure you have the time, making sure that the budget is going to be adequate for what you want to do. And then making sure that you'll be able to establish like a timeline for your successful completion. Getting into the action, so contacting the funder, keeping in mind things that are going to take you the longest. So if there's a 40-page narrative, it's probably better to kind of start on that on the earlier end of you getting the proposal together than waiting until like the last week when you have everything else and now you have to like actually tackle the writing. And I know as graduate students, with all the writing that you might be doing, that can be kind of hard. So thinking about how you can partner with people to also get some of this work done. Obtaining letters of reference and partnership, making sure you're reaching out to potential partners in this work so that you're giving them enough lead time to get you what they need, especially if they're going to be a part of the budget or like you're going to need information from them to figure out some parts of the narrative. It's really important for you to get that information from them early. Writing, so this is where you're really like tackling the big writing sections of it, making sure that your budget and your budget narrative are aligned. And the writing round is also around, a place to include your adequate feedback opportunities. So making sure that if you are able to get all of your writing in the narrative done and other elements of the proposal done, that you're giving it maybe to MyPar, or you're giving it to other classmates or colleagues or faculty members so that they have adequate time to give you feedback about it and make any edits and revisions that are needed, and would really maximize your chances at getting the award. And then finalizing and submitting everything. No joke, some of the submission processes, like in grants.gov, Deb, I'm sure you can relate to this. Sometimes those submission process, I've been in there for like 2 hours doing it, just straight up, like just making sure everything is where it needs to be, making sure that the documents are in the format that the funder wants to see. Like there have been times, the most crazy time, and I might have even mentioned this to you and Dr. Malins and Deb, but I led a Fulbright program a couple of years ago, a Fulbright group project abroad, and I submitted everything, and grants.gov had indicated that they accepted everything. And often when a portal accepts the documents that you submit, you assume that they've been submitted in the format that the funder wants, right? So it was like, I don't even know, maybe a Friday evening or early afternoon evening. I wasn't even in the office that day. and we get a call from the Department of Education that's like, hey, you submitted an Excel spreadsheet for the budget, and yes, we accepted it in the portal, but like technically it needs to be a PDF, and you have like an hour to get it in, or we're not going to look at your proposal, which had taken like 6 weeks to put together. So we had to get that in really, really quickly. And that was a good lesson for me that, like, you know, even if something is accepted, it's still just best to go exactly by what the funder says they want, and not even try to submit anything beyond what they say they want in their preferences and their requirements.
Can I speak that for 1 second? Just
Sure.
to reassure the grad students, those portals can be horrific. The good news for you guys is we actually will go in and do that for you. We will make sure that all the components in grants.gov, FastLane, even if it's a foundation's website, if you would prefer for us to go in and load the documents and make sure that everything's spot on, we will do that for you. OSP checks it after we do it. So it's checked by us and it's checked by OSP. So usually by the time it gets to NSF or NIH, it's completed and it's done properly. So just know that helps there.
Thank you. That's awesome. I think I was more or less like our grants.gov at the institution I was working at. So yeah, it was surprising. I was glad that we got it in because we ended up getting it. But had we not, I don't know what the impacts would have been, and I'm afraid it would have just disqualified our entire application. So
they will. They'll disqualify it for this.
They're very strict.
Yeah. Yes.
They're looking for reasons to weed it out so they don't have to read.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right.
But it also, you know, paying attention to what the requirements are for a submission is an indication of how you potentially, as a recipient of the funding, are going to be in the way of like reporting accurately and actually managing the project well. So it can be a good indication that you'll be a good partner in that funding. So institution-specific considerations and limitations, again, go to MyPAR for all of this information. But the indirect cost rate agreement, making sure you at least understand that and talking with MyPAR about where that might be put into different elements of your application. Thinking about audit requirements and parameters. This is also a big thing for Deb's office to talk with you through. For example, I know that I was at an institution that wasn't a research institution by any means. So it did not, we weren't coming close to sort of the level of research funding that would require an additional audit process. However, I know at some institutions, depending on how much research funding you're receiving, getting over a certain level. So if your money that you would be getting from the funding puts you over this certain level of federal funding, there's an additional sort of audit process in place that your institution would need to have. And sometimes that's a make it or break it because it can be very expensive. So just making sure that you know what you're trying to do and the funding you would get wouldn't impact your institution in that way, in what could end up being a very expensive way. And if you're unsure about anything in your application, in your proposal, in your budget, it's always a good idea to talk with MyPAR, who I assume would reach out to legal counsel, to the grants offices, to finance, the controller's office, whoever needs to be included in any conversations about an aspect of your application that you have questions about. Proofing your proposal, so going through, making sure that you do have all the components, making sure you have all the necessary approvals and processes in place, making sure when you've reformatted it to fit the needs or the requirements of the funder, that your page limits haven't changed significantly and that you're still within the requirements. Thinking about how your proposal would augment previous successful proposals and sort of take the work of the funder to the next step, so that if they call you about your proposal, you're ready to talk about some of those kinds of things. It's always helpful, I think, and sometimes it's not possible, but it's helpful if you are able to submit prior to the deadline to go in to MyPAR at least before their deadline so they can start getting everything together for you, and then trying to get it, trying to basically make sure that everything went through like a day before, because especially in grants.gov and some of the other government portals that I have worked with, sometimes submitting on the deadline day, things just crash. It's because everybody else is also submitting their, like, you know, I don't even know how many kilobyte proposals. So it's a good practice to try to get it in earlier than you can. And then making sure that you have a read receipt, a return receipt, or some sort of indication that your proposal was successfully submitted. So I've listed a couple of grant writing resources here, and you'll receive, I think you'll receive a copy of this, or this will also all be posted to the YouTube channel for the center. But yeah, these are some great places. I frequent these places when I'm looking to kind of get a little boost of a skill that I haven't maybe used in a while, or just looking at maybe how some of the best practices and recommendations for writing grants have changed. You know, how to incorporate, for example, DEI or JEDI into applications and things like that. This is becoming something that I'm finding a bit more about on different resources that I've listed here. So these are just some general ones, and there are just tons out there on YouTube. You can find 2 and 3 hour workshops on YouTube about grant writing as well, if you want to really start diving down that rabbit hole. Looking at rubrics and thinking about how you're going to be reviewed is really important, and it's good to, you know, take a break, like a day or two from the proposal that you've written, and then come back to it with the perspective of a reviewer, and knowing the rubric, if it's possible to get that, and keeping that in mind as you go through the proposal that you've written is really good practice for understanding where you might have some weaknesses, where you might get some deductions and points, and where you might really sort of stand out. So this is just a sample points assignment. I think this was actually taken directly from the Fulbright that I wrote a couple years ago. But this talks about, you know, how they ended up giving us the points. And what's interesting in the rubric is that there are some things that sometimes aren't given any points at all, like letters of support from partners, but that you still have to include. So sometimes that's actually a great excuse to reach out to the program officer and ask, you know, I see that my letters of support are not included in the rubric, but how much will they impact the overall standing of my proposal? So it's just something to think about. You know, you don't want to write, and in terms of like even planning your proposal process and your timeline for completing it, you don't want to spend like, you know, most of your time on the calendar of activities and keep coming back to that, but then maybe neglect a little bit more like the monitoring and evaluation plan or the program description, because the calendar is worth less than those other things. So thinking about importance wise where all of these components fit in might also help you in terms of planning your time to get the proposal complete. So that's the completion of our workshop generally. That's the conclusion of part 3. So here's some questions to think about as you would be gearing up for submission for a proposal, and then sort of your assignment to make sure you're really ready to be there, going through your proposal with the rubric and thinking about how you might be able to strengthen any areas where you feel like you're not going to get the maximum amount of points. So lots of information, but if anybody has any questions, please feel free to drop them here. If you've been thinking about a proposal throughout this entire process, these are some questions maybe to think through as well. If you've been thinking about a proposal through this workshop, you know, if you've been going back and forth between proposal ideas for some funding, thinking about if this might have changed your ideas or made you think about how you're going to actually complete the proposal, and thinking through, you know, the different aspects of planning this out, just how this is going to impact your work getting funding. So I thank you all for your time. This is just the last slide and talks about like what happens if you get the funding and what happens if you don't get the funding. But if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And these are all things I know that my PAR can talk with you about as well if you do receive the funding or you don't receive the funding. So yeah, that's it for me. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great.
You're welcome.